Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. We have episode 31, and I'm presented with a very special guest. His name is Matthew Witt, and he's a professor of public administration at the University of Laverne. That's in Los Angeles County, California. And he has lots of publications to his name. We're going to talk about one in particular today from the Flashpoint in Ukraine book. He has a chapter that I've been reading for the last few weeks. It's called The Labyrinth of Geography in the Time of Imperial Terror, which talks about the Russo-Ukrainian war that's going on right now. And he has a lot of other publications that interested me as well. One in particular that we won't talk about today is called The Other Made Black. I read that as well. That was interesting. But one that I do want to share about today is called From Greta Thunberg, who is the climate activist, to the Great Reset. He has an article that talks about kind of the connection between the COVID crisis and the World Economic Forum and all these different economic situations and problems, and how you can't see them as separate entities. And so we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today, not only Russia and Ukraine, but also Greta Thunberg as well. Welcome to the show, Matt, and I appreciate the invitation again, acceptance.
Thanks so much, Kiko. It's an honor to be here with you.
Yes, you're part of you're guest number 2 out of 3 in this series of Russia Ukraine, and the third guest will be Jeffrey Summers that will meet with us March the 21st. And so I want the audience to get a wide-ranging perspective of this conflict that's going on right now. And we've established yesterday with Jack Rasmus that this did not start out of thin air, and I think all of our guests would agree with that assessment. And so it's important to sort of combat the corporate news outlets and their narratives that they continuously push to us, and kind of get firsthand accounts and people who study stuff, people who are professors, people who are dedicated to being truth seekers and not so much into lining up their purses and their pocketbooks with corporate news money. So again, I appreciate you accepting the invitation. And I wanted to start by asking you, how do you see the situation now compared to back then in 2014? Because I'm surprised just all the different chapters I'm reading and the people I talk to, they say that their views haven't changed a whole lot from 2014 to now. What would you say would be some of your changes, if any at all, or if you've been pretty consistent about your stance in the current conflict?
Thank you, Kiko. That's a great question. I think rereading the piece now, it's been several years since that came out. Stephen Ledman was marvelous to work with. I don't know if you've spoken with him. I haven't spoken with him for some time. He pulled together a broad range of writers, thinkers, etc. in that effort, and I think he was very much ahead of the curve and on the bubble on that one. I see what's happening now as the sort of unsurprising continuation of what was happening in 2014, which for those paying attention then was the unsurprising continuation of what had happened since 2004. So which would lead to the conclusion that all of this has been in the works for some time, and that we have, a geopolitical chess moves, as it were, coming to fruition as staged and planned, going back at least into the late 90s, and if we were to accept some premises, decades and decades earlier, under the scheme of the grand chessboard of Mackinder. So yeah, I'm not surprised at all what's going on. The blowing up of the pipe of Nord Stream, all of the circumstantial, if not material evidence, indicates the U.S. staged it, made it happen, was in partnership with Norway and Sweden. This has been planned for some time, and to the dismay, if you if you hear Cy Hirsch or have read his Substack piece on this, to the to the dismay and consternation of our own intelligence communities, who does what it does very carefully out of view. But for the hand to be tipped so recklessly by Biden and Victoria Nuland, and a couple of other, sort of spacing the names at the moment, who tipped the hand beforehand. In fact, it wasn't just a few. It was, I mean, Ted Cruz was in on calling for Ted Cruz, the consummate chameleon politician from the right. I cannot give him enough credit for reading tea leaves about how to maneuver himself. That he was tipping the hand. There's a reel on this. Someone did a mashup recently on all of the people tipping hand on this, culminating with Biden himself. We're going to take it out. Trust me, we have the means. It's not going to be there anymore. Oh, really? Oh, really? And the utter implausibility of Russia taking out intelligence. I mean, it's making absolutely no sense. And then no attempt for even a fig leaf justification, except to keep repeating the line or avoiding the story altogether, which can be managed easily under the current control of political institutions by our media. So the story is just made to go away.
We were talking about some people that we discussed yesterday. You mentioned Victoria Nuland, you mentioned Biden, obviously. But you know what's interesting, Professor Witt? There's one person, even in the conversation that we had yesterday in the first installment, that I haven't heard yet. There's a name I haven't heard. His name is Barack Obama. And I bring his name up because this activity happened during his presidency. And when I was reading your article, I don't know if it was from a sarcastic point of view or not, but you seem to be giving Obama a little bit of the benefit of the doubt when it came to what the known neocons' plans were when it came to the Russia-Ukraine situation then. What would your assessment be of that or whatever? Is that a mischaracterization, or were you kind of going in, sort of giving him the benefit of the doubt before you concluded that it was probably part of the whole conspiracy?
Pico, I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. You have that right. So, ex post facto, we can see, particularly with his rhetoric following on later in his administration towards all things Ukraine and Putin, that he either was flipped or he was always to script where he could occupy the middle and then rhetorically, tactically maneuver his way in any particular direction. Obama has to be credited as, if not nearly as great, perhaps greater, a political tactician than Ronald Reagan in his capacity to be mercurial and persuasive and astonishingly talented, and every bit a deep state player, absolutely briefed into the deep state, completely to the bottom of it, almost certainly, at least as much as anyone else, Bill Clinton, George Bush, and so on. I think he's absolutely been briefed into the bottom of it.
Yeah, it's just it's interesting because all this happened during and then you had other situations with Syria, you had Libya, you had Benghazi, you had everything else going on.
Yes.
And it's just you have to conclude at some point that stuff just doesn't happen by chance, because this is in the name of his foreign policy or her foreign policy. Yeah. And we see that there's a consistent line of U.S. foreign policy which involves the justification of war, whether it's a proxy war or the troops themselves going on the ground into these areas. And we kind of set that tone with the history, but I was thinking about this term that you brought up in your article from Flashpoint in Ukraine, you kept talking about the Washington Consensus, and can you kind of enlighten the audience what is the Washington Consensus and how does that play into the current situation with Ukraine and Russia?
You bet, Kiko. So the Washington Consensus, it's a great question, because that mantra, basically, which was a circular logic founded on the premise that above the fray of otherwise ideological politics and divide, there was a consensus among the state elites, including, the apparatchiks that come in and out of State Department back into academia, that are on the consulting and speaking circuit, that the consensus would have it that with the fall of the Soviet, the economic orthodoxy of neoliberalism now stood unrivaled and triumphant across the world, and for anyone willing to accept its premises of rigorous control of state spending, particularly with regard to social supports, pensions, medical care, Medicare for all in its incarnation across the globe in developing nations, devotions to modest tariff protections against global finance and corporations that would have them these hobbled economies, one way or the other, hobbled under the yoke of colonial powers for centuries. That all of that had to yield to the protocols of the International Monetary Fund, what it calls for structural adjustment programs, to privatize the leasing of mineral rights to foreign nationals, to subject currencies to free-floating currency evaluations, and in general impose a tyranny of debt, of a menu of debt options and obligations on developing countries whose only asset is their raw resources, whose only asset is what they've still have mostly underground, and that the consensus was a laundering of this set of protocols that are neocolonial through and through. But with the fall of the Soviet and well-placed editorials and op-eds giving account of its lingering influence on developing nations and their positions towards global capital and their resistance, and given their resistance, their proclivity then seamlessly into what the West would call, opportunistic populist demagogues, Chavez, Hussein, the list goes on, and corresponds remarkably closely with what Wesley Clark, when Wesley Clark said the quiet part out loud on Democracy Now! About the 7 nations that were slated to fall, that he was briefed in when he was Joint Chiefs, when he was his position with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Wesley Clark, formerly Army General. That was his division. And he said, it would start with this schedule of collapse of countries. Iraq was only the first. Then would be Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, and then back to Iran. So all of which fell except for Iran. Although we've had bombastic and militant and extremely dangerous rhetorical brinkmanship toward Iran for decades. We've never managed to stage a coup from within successfully. We have not managed to subject Iran to what the author of Economic Hitman, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins would describe, culminating with all sorts of offers they couldn't refuse. Iran has consistently refused our offers to abide our programs for incorporating it into our geopolitics. And now we have it aligned in the BRIC coalition and more, in a way, more threatening than ever. I don't know if I've answered or drifted too much off your point of Washington consensus, but in a nutshell, I think maybe that covers it.
I'd say so. I was jotting notes while you were talking about the Washington consensus, and you mentioned the debt crisis. And that's one of the immediate things that stood out reading your article and Rasmus's article is I almost feel like Ukraine is being used as a justification to just pile up more debt, because you mentioned the pensions. And from what I understand, reading the collection of articles in this book, Flashpoint in Ukraine, the pensions of the Ukrainian citizens themselves are being basically cut into because of this constant war. And so you have an economic crisis going on. It's not just because it's easy to scapegoat Ukrainian people, but it's our government that's funding these wars. I mean, it takes somebody to fund the wars. And you mentioned these international financial institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. Treasury. I mean, you have all these different financial corporations and entities funding these projects. I mean, somebody has to fund this stuff. So I guess I would warn my audience to be careful, blaming Ukraine. Or that's why we got to get away from the binaries, pro-Russia, pro-Ukraine, anti-Ukraine, anti-Russia. We got to get away from the binaries because these are real people that are suffering. We're suffering too. And we're going to feel the consequences of this. We are feeling the consequences of it, because ultimately the everyday citizens are going to get the brunt of the oppression from these types of military actions. So I want my audience to know that it's not just affecting the citizens here and our economy, but the Ukrainian citizens there and their middle class, their lower class, their lower income families and stuff are gravely affected by these actions. And probably Russia too. So I don't want it to be like this pointing fingers contest, because everyday citizens are struggling. And I think the media does a good job of that, as presenting the United States as the savior. And then, Ukraine, we have to save Ukraine, is so crucial to our humanity, even though they're committing inhumane acts right now with all the killings and stuff. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting if you think about it, just the humane aspect of it alone, aside from the financial crisis itself. But did you have a response to that? And I had a curious question about what you refer to as transition economies.
Sure. With regard, only to affirm everything you just said about the consequences of the Ukrainian war for everyday people on the ground in Ukraine, to say nothing of also US, Germany, Europe, with the tactical explosion of gas. That's no small threat to the circumstances of fixed income and not so fixed income German people and other parts of Europe, because Germany was reselling surplus that it took in enormous batches on contract from Russia. and reselling it to other markets in Europe. That's how cheap the gas was coming from Russia. So, but there now that this has precipitated, the Nord Stream explosion has precipitated a major heating crisis with perfect timing. So yes and yes. To say nothing of the propaganda blitz on the American people on the heels of the propaganda blitz that was COVID, and there's many ways to look at the pairing of those. Maybe we'll go there later, but that Ukraine has represented a tactical geopolitical space for some time is undisputed, that we have to narrativize all of that in terms of American pieties and freedoms and virtue signal and cue up the liberal taste for righteous declamations of all things Russian and Putin, and the prodding of that for many years. And I stopped counting on my hand all the friends with PhDs who spout talking points from the New York Times as if that's fidelity to their creed and craft as professional intellectuals. It's astonishing, the willingness to succumb to this propaganda, which is scientifically derived and seamlessly woven into the everyday construction of self-purpose in society in the United States. It's astonishing. I'd like to come back to that at some point, and the study that I've recently come across from alerted to by a blogger I respect a lot, Toby Rogers. He has a Substack, Utobian. I'll give a plug there for him. And your kind of thinker, Kiko, and I think for your listeners. But he refers in a recent post to this was posted Feb 21, how anti-corporate agnotology studies got swamped by pro-corporate misinformation studies. Agnotology is the study of the manufacture of ignorance. It was coined by, the author, Robert Proctor, and an edited version of essays from 2008 under the title Agnotology, the Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, edited by Proctor and Londa Schiebinger. And it describes ways in which toxic industries condition society to accept products that cause harm. And so case studies focus on the tobacco industry, of course, but also the pharmaceutical industry. Why I bring it up is and I think a keynote for what I take you wishing for our talk today is the ways in which the constructions of narrative around Ukraine, COVID, and other crises, emergencies, are essentially opportunities walked around the block. And because they otherwise would be challenged under conditions of a sober public that was not locked down, fearful of neighbors, terrorized by the specter of pandemic, unable to transact any kind of meaningful and even not so meaningful exchanges and discourses that we count on. On the heels of that comes Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And and anyone. So then comes the misinformation, disinformation, malinformation studies and industry that Rogers gives account as a response to this very probing formulation of agnotology, the study of how ignorance is manufactured. So whereas, Chomsky gave us the manufacture of consent, here Proctor and others are giving us the manufacture of ignorance, which one could say precedes consent. You don't get to consent without going by way of ignorance. And the sort of narrowing of any sense of choice and options, dissent, and individual integrity and sovereignty to size up conditions and weigh them in exchange with others, without facing constantly the fear of being labeled as conspiracy theorist, as misinformation spreader, which was the new one with COVID, yeah. And with and then the spectacular, you're racist if you question anything about the intentions of the pharmaceutical companies. Now this is really spellbinding. When it was the pharmaceutical companies, arguably, that have produced a medical apartheid in the United States, if not across the globe. And so everything that the gangster state has in fact perped, from the undoing of Ukraine, from the positioning of so-called civil society operations in one state after the other, which are just cutouts for deep state maneuvers that are beyond the glare of congressional oversight. And they're venues for laundering all sorts of cash in country that positions groups like the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, who deployed on signal, almost certainly from Newland, to take over parliament and terrorize the country. And then our press very conveniently dismisses, discounts, downplays, and when forced its hand, concedes the point. But since we're now in the fog of war, atrocities are on all sides, and come on, this band of Nazis, whoever they are surely a minority and compare nothing with, and can you blame the conflagration on them when Putin was the aggressor? Even Cy Hirsch says Putin will take to his grave. And I had a recent interview with him that I saw on, just sort of otherwise really soft, it's called The Hill Rising. The couple of young, I forget their names. One guy is
Robbie Suave? Robbie Suave?
Yes.
Suave? Yeah.
Robbie Suave and the gal who they've now put into position.
Brianna Joy Gray, who was kind of who was a commentator previously and really sort of by far their most sort of gifted speaker in their, in the stable of whom they had. They got rid of who they couldn't control, who was either a ridiculous embarrassment. What's his name? Ryan Grimm. Graham Reaper is what they call him.
Yeah, he was an embarrassment for missteps. And then they got rid of, I'm spacing her name because she was actually throwing real punches. Kim Iverson, thank you, Kiko. And she posted up independently on her own, and she was excellent during COVID. Very careful, very measured, but hard hitting. So then you got Suave and Brianna Joy Gray, and they play the fools if they're not actually. But seeing them interview Hirsch, who, in the case of Brianna Joy Gray, had thrown all sorts of just rhetorically bloated criticisms at that were straw man arguments and just kind of the puffball nothing weeks ago. Then to see her engage Hirsch and see him manage these two was pretty extraordinary, and a huge credit to Hirsch for and credit to both Joy Gray and Suave for conceding conceding the weight of his argument and his logic and his defense of keeping sources confidential when they kept pushing. Can you give us any hint? No. If you're a real journalist, you'd understand why he can't. So why are you even picking that bone?
Mm-hmm.
So he dismissed them very handily. He's been doing this for decades. This isn't his first rodeo by a long shot. He knows how, but he's extremely adroit. And in that space, why I bring that up, Hirsch said, Putin is going to have to take to his grave responsibility for starting this war. Full stop. Nothing from Hirsch in this interview that I recall about everything the United States did to instigate his actions, leaving him no choice at some point in the sequence of moves. Going back at least to 2004, the Maidan, the color revolution of 2004, which set up the sequences for the crisis, the Flashpoint, as it were, in 2014, and then where we find ourselves now. But nothing from Hirsch on all of those moves. He dropped one. He said, sort of NATO's been encroaching on Ukraine, and but I don't know it's not that important. But by way of establishing how these moves happened, imagine Russia in Mexico.
Yeah, that's the same example that Rasmus brought up yesterday. Jack Rasmus brought up the same example yesterday. Just imagine if Mexico was Russia, and you're talking about the territories that used to be a part of Mexico, just like Eastern Ukraine, you have majority Russian populations there in Eastern Ukraine, but people here don't seem to understand that. I think that's what it is because they've already been drawn into that coma because of the narrative that's already been set about, okay, Ukraine is part of us, basically, is the way they sell it. But they don't talk about anything because people here have a very low quality of information when it comes to geography. I think just the people I talked to, they couldn't even identify most of these countries on a map, like in Eastern Europe or anywhere. Sure. And so they play on people's ignorance when it comes to geography and politics. And because I know a lot of people who are politically conscious, but when it comes to geopolitical and foreign affairs, they have very low information base when it comes to that. But they may be stronger on social issues like the justice system or something, but they don't have a clue about foreign policy or anything at all. It's just, I think they exploit that, and they know that they're exploiting that out of people. And I think people get to a certain point where, even with Cy Hirsch, like you were saying, I think that there's this pressure to go against people within your circles. And this is really prevalent in academia, where Kiko and Matt can't take a stance that's too far out there because you're going to be affiliated with the opposition. I get this all the time. But do you realize that the opposition is just like the fellow citizens of the country? I mean, the same people who you were demonizing, like you said, during the COVID situation and everything else. That's how they played it. They've done a good job of villainizing everyone, depending on what the topic is. And it can be just an array of topics, but like you've eloquently explained and you talked about in your articles, even this newer one that you published last year, I think it was May of 2022, from Greta to the Great Reset, making emergencies work. You talk a lot about how every crisis has to have chess pieces on the board. Like every crisis has to have not only a funding base, but it has to have people and the figureheads that are operating whether they're controlling Greta Thunberg or anybody else that could be well-intentioned at one point, but they have to at some point succumb to the system. What we call the deep state that people think is a conspiracy theory, but it's not. I mean, if you really think about it, it's just a complex, intricate networking of people who control the world. I mean, World Economic Forum, all these people. I think that's what people struggle with. They can't piece all that stuff together. And the deep state is aware that these people cannot piece. How does foreign policy in Ukraine, how does that connect with the debt crisis here? Or how does that connect with the criminal justice system here? They
Right.
can't connect the dots.
Right.
And I think that they've exploited that so well with people because it makes you think a lot more.
A voice that comes to mind that does a marvelous job is Glenn Ford, the Black Agenda Report.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah.
If you haven't yet, maybe you'd consider having Ford on in terms of making connections that otherwise short circuit, the good liberal, the indoctrinated liberal, who otherwise would like to believe they're, sufficiently informed about all matters, race related matters, sort of class related. They've learned the politesse of being correct in according to the pieties, correct. And so Ford is really outstanding with just
you have to go back and you have to listen to episode 4 with Margaret Kimberly. I interviewed the co-founder of the Black Agenda Report. Glenn Ford actually passed last year. He just passed.
I'm sorry. Oh gosh,
he had just passed. I think it may have been back in September because Black Agenda Report did an op-ed on him and talked about like his legacy and helping found the Black Agenda Report and just all of his like civil rights advocacy just throughout the years and stuff. But yes, I was able to interview Margaret Kimberly, and she'll probably be back on the forum at a later time. But yeah, we talked a lot about this game of the manipulation of populations and just the we call it blackface. It's basically the modern version of blackface where you don't have to use white people's faces anymore. You just use black people and they somehow represent every other black person in the space. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, but they've been successful doing that, unfortunately. And we know that the Democrats in particular does a good job of that. But the Republicans are even now, of course, they're going to naturally pick up on that allegiance and the messaging because they're the rivals to the Democrats, and so they're going to use the same virtue signaling and the symbolism, this fake symbolism, to kind of get people on their messaging.
Yeah, I mean, if we had more time or another time to speak on this issue of the inversion of party politics, inversions, conversions of party politics in the United States, I would love to. What's astonishing to me on that point, not to drift off here from Ukraine focus and where you wanted to go with that in the time.
No, you're good. Now, the Ukraine stuff is fine. I mean, it's all within context or whatever. We can go back to Ukraine, but no, keep on with your point.
The what's astonishing to me, Kiko, is the flipping that we're seeing of party discourse allegiances. So whereas I never would have imagined Tucker Carlson, of all people, speaking to someone like Jimmy Dore. In fact, in a long form interview, hosting a long form interview with Jimmy Dore, and that Jimmy Dore, a guy like Jimmy Dore, who's classic old school leftist with a lot of integrity, sticking to his principles and taking huge hits to his career, to say nothing of friendships and so on, and the constant threat of slander for what he does with his podcast, right? Jimmy Dore sitting down with Tucker Carlson. And like Tucker Carlson, Fox News, reliably across his career, very, sort of a dandy conservative. Forever he wore the bow tie. He's played kind of this,
The crossfire days.
yeah, he played kind of a dandy and a like a flaneur, like this guy that was above it and a bit like old school. Oh, the name will come back to me. Um, uh, Buckley, William
Oh
Buckley.
yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
He, Carlson apes a bit of a Buckley with nowhere near Buckley's intellectual chops.
Right.
But I respect what Carlson's been doing and the care he's taken in transitioning to criticisms that I, as an old school left, can get with, and where Dorr, a comedian, right? That's his career has been as a comedian. He flipped to podcasting when he got first he got into this sort of free form. He was with the Young Turks for a hot minute, and then he got completely bumped out because he refused to go along with their caving in to the party politics on Medicare and the collapse of the so-called squad, the capitulation of the squad to Pelosi, and also his refusal to accept his refusal to accept the narrative on the Putin stealing the election. And he's out early on Syria. He was there beginning to size up the fix being in, and it took him a bit to get there. But the right sort of Neo-like in the Matrix, discovering what he thought he could count on Bernie Sanders, he couldn't. Right, that this was all chimera. This was all the manufacture of dissent and breach with the machine politics that had become the Democratic Party, certainly under the Clinton regime, but beginning to tilt that way with with Jimmy Carter. The capitulation to Brzezinski and the other influences of the Council on Foreign Relations and the locking in of this geopolitical convergence of consensus, culminating the Washington consensus, so-called, of Democrats and Republicans, a high point for the convergence, a low point for those of us who dreaded it coming, was the declaration of the new Democrats under Clinton, which was really the same old Republicans. And then you had the convergence, the continuing convergence of the alliance between the massive conservative shift of labor under Tony Blair that paralleled the relations between Thatcher and Reagan. Mm-hmm. And so you had then this sort of complete blurring of lines over what was to be the new compact of the only nominally distinctive Republican and nominally distinctive Democratic Party. We eventually which got narrowed down to matters of a choice and abortion and identity politics. And this is all you got to talk about over that. Once that got locked in, it was all we could discuss, and everything else was out of bounds, more and more out of bounds and elusive. And this eventually coincided with, it was 2014, the Smith Modernization Act, previous to which it was against the law for State Department and allied agencies like the CIA to propagandize the American people. It was against the law going back decades. The propaganda could only be directed, platformed, disseminated, licensed. When it was directed to Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Cuba, right? But verboten to channel the organs of propaganda directly on American people. Smith Modernization, which happened under Obama, pulled all the pegs on that. Now it was legal for the United States organs of state with the apparatus of the media to lie directly to the American people with impunity, propagandize the American people with impunity, culminating, I would say, most recently with a January 6th insurrection that was not.
Insurrection.
Now I'm back to Carlson for what it's worth, and you can be dubious of Carlson for all sorts of reasons. I'm not. This is no hagiography of Tucker Carlson, but that he's willing to host counter propaganda inquiry, and that he is, it would seem, one way or the other, in a privileged position to do so at Fox. Is kind of remarkable. The most recent disclosure is the video log that the Republicans forced out of whichever agency had provenance over the video log of what happened January 6th in the hallways of Congress, of the Capitol, and making very clear that claims about what happened were lies, flagrant lies in 3 or 4 instances. Then there's the notoriousness of Ray Epps, who's there and not there, who's almost certainly an asset on contract with FBI as an instigator and provocateur, who many eyewitnesses said was fulfilling that role perfectly. Of course, all dismissed. That this now is the next to blow up. All of this goes back. Everything goes back, right? And to your excellent point, Kiko, about the bewilderment of the American people before the complexities that you and I have time and privilege to kind of probe and get into, right? It's kind of our job, our vocation. Even for the most curious, unenfranchised citizen type, it's virtually impossible now because of the noise machine and the flooding of channel of where the real source of malinformation, misinformation, disinformation is the U.S. government. It always has been the real source. And at some point, I know we're running short on time, I'd love to get back around to, you mentioned reading a piece by me, The Other Made Black. For many years, I worked on race issues and the influence of them on the scholarly output of public administration work, and the marginalization of matters of race and racialization in the discourse of public administration theory and scholarship. And I kind of dug in, and I, by way of fracturing the capacity of the American people to decipher and decode the first among equal deceptions in this country, which has to do with the social construction of race as a real thing when it's absolutely a no thing, has to be given account. And for us to start breaking down the blinkers, in my opinion, because if that doesn't happen, the day-to-day circumstances of Americans have been so racialized that in order for them to see past the chimera and deceptions and propaganda, projecting them always outward, if they do not see what is inward, I'm afraid my premise is that we will always succumb to a kind of somnambulism, a sleepwalking through what otherwise could wake us up. I think that the matters, and I've always thought matters of race are hugely important to breaking the code for Americans to understand that first among many deceptions has laid groundwork for the blinkering, the snookering, the gaslighting of the great many of us who otherwise would have forged common cause long ago, collectively together, because we were taught to see race. We never saw it in the first place. That was a huge threat. Testament to which is given by the decade of assassinations of the 60s. The assassinations we know about and those that we don't know about, that the public has no idea were actually happened. Sam Cooke, almost certainly a hit by the state. Show me the average, as it were, white person who has any idea about that.
Right.
What little more they know about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King had a Secret Service detail and early and continuous notifications of any threats against him until he started speaking about Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Until when he started talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and because he saw clearly, and always did, he just had his calendar date with that particular fate was inevitable. Almost certainly he was aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
That to forge common cause between working whites, Anglo-ethnics, and the Black experience, and the other ethnic experience in the U.S. That was the move that got him killed. So long as he could be relied upon to hew to the narrative that this was a coming of age for the country to concede a certain smidges of civil rights, he was useful as a wedge figure.
Mm-hmm.
In party politics, and he was useful. He was useful to them also for retiring the criticism from the South that was very legitimate about the origins of the war. Who really assassinated Abraham Lincoln, which was, Wilkes Booth was a British agent. Lincoln was killed because of his moves against the financial syndicate that Britain was central to, with his pledge to authorize print and utilization of the greenback. So his signal that he would refuse to concede currency that would continuously establish debt with Britain is what got him killed. Malcolm X was killed when he began speaking ecumenically across sides for peace. The peacemakers, those who challenge the international cabal of imperial financial interests, they're killed for that reason. Up until that point, they can be useful for narratives that deflect or otherwise fold under the consciousness a more critical discussion of what's going on. When I bring up the South, that's not to say the deeply paranoid, delusional racism of the South from way back, because of the existential threat that many higher numbers of slaves posed, that Black people posed to white people that were subjecting them to those cruelties. That is logical enough. The narrative of racial hierarchy and caste was just a convenience to rationalize what they saw needing done in a basically an occupied state where they were at constant threat of being overrun, as would eventually happen in Haiti. So,
Yeah.
that it became racialized was to sell poor whites on the idea that where they had nothing otherwise, they had the endowment of race and that legacy to bank their esteem on. I don't think I'm saying anything terribly radical here.
No, 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 no.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, do you have another half hour or do you have to go?
I have some more time. I can talk more.
Okay, because when you said cut it short, I was like, no, don't cut it short. If you got time, I'm good. I'm good for another half hour at least. So
Sure.
just so you know. But I wanted to bring up something that you talked about. You talked about Carson and Dora. I will push back some of that, and you're entitled to your opinion. And so I follow Dora a little bit, but honestly, and we've talked a little bit about it on the forum. I kind of avoid the Jimmy Dore stuff because I don't think he's as genuine as you're portraying it.
Okay.
I get the appeal. I think that that's a great message to work across class lines and racial lines. I wish I want to believe that he's been genuine, but I don't believe it.
Okay.
I don't believe that Carson is genuine either. I honestly believe that's part of capitalism. Personally, I think that they're both fueled by their audience engagement because they see their numbers growing. So, what does Carson have to lose to bring someone like Jimmy Dore on, who's obviously, if you look at his, I'm not going to call the Fox viewers like ignorant people, but they have a certain level of ignorance when it comes to the party affiliation stuff with the red team and the blue team. They're just as ignorant as the MSNBC crowd with Rachel Maddow. And so I think that that's just Dore adds a nuanced element to the left because he overtly talks against the Democratic Party and their agenda and stuff. And he does to the Republicans too. I mean, but I think he massages it away to where he can get in that audience because they're like, oh, well, at least he's not a Democrat. That's what the Fox viewer is watching. I don't think that they're connecting the dots between he's bringing together anti-war sentiments and class divisions and racial divisions all together and trying to understand this melting pot of intersectionalities of people. I don't think that that's what the people are getting out of it at all, just based on just talking to people in the comments. I just think that they like it, that they're getting another angle of dissent against the Democrats or whoever else they don't like. I think it's more audience engagement. And even the way Dore sets his podcast up is, to me, is very clickbaity. And if you compare it to my forum, it's very much intimate discussion. And I don't know. I just think that Jimmy Dore says the things that we already think just louder. Honestly, that's just me. I don't think he's this special, important figure in the movement of any kind. I just think that he's an elevated voice. And honestly, I found out about him because of when he left the Young Turks. I mean, he still talks stuff about the Young Turks now. And I'm like, dude, that happened how long ago? Like 7 years ago? And you're still talking about something that happened in 2016 with you and Anna Kasparian? I just think that all these channels are like that, these quote unquote leftist channels and the conservative ones, they're set up to where they have this embedded enemy within. They have this this BreadTube enemy, which is like a whole block of people. So even the people that I used to follow, like the Revolutionary Blackout people, they have arguments with the Vanguard. They don't like Kim Iverson. They don't like the Hill. They don't like Breaking Points with Sagar and Crystal. And then you have the other people who don't like their people. I don't get into that stuff here at all. And I like Jimmy Dore's approach and stuff, but that's where I see there's a vast separation with me ideologically and people like him. I think he's in for clout chasing personally. I want to believe that he's in for the right reasons. Like I know he's been to some of the anti-war rallies, and I commend him for that. I commend him for his stances on unions and stuff. But I also think that he's growing his base too. I think it comes down to him growing his base because he has a lot of conservatives that follow his channel and stuff. And maybe he will bring those people together and they can understand. As long as those people can understand that this is a class struggle and not this identity politics stuff, maybe I can get on board with it. I'm not convinced yet. I haven't seen enough to convince myself of that yet.
I appreciate your as it were, pushback critique. one factor here to determine is the viewership of both, and to your point, growing it. Carlson is now pulling, the last I heard, I'd have to go back and check the source, Kiko, but we can confirm that. He's pulling a growing Democratic viewership, a sort of sort of a swing vote type of Democrat, right? And that's significant. Again, I'll confess a soft spot for Dore because maybe I can relate to his anger. I respect his willingness, his suffering, the indignities of lost friends from COVID, which I've suffered, and colleagues that won't talk to you. And I've established nothing like the profile he has with his million viewers, with my, 3 dozen so there's not a my empathy for what I understand him doing is there because we can feel that. It's a phenomenon that I'm struck by. It's not so much the personalities, it's a phenomenon. The extent to which Dore gives voice to class politics, where you can find it virtually nowhere else, certainly nowhere in other words, it's distinctive. He's distinctive for being one of extremely few, and that he is utterly disenfranchised of the mainstream is relevant in that regard, and that the platform of internet and YouTube up to a point, of course, but now the move to Rumble, because you can actually say something about COVID in Rumble that's honest. And that really bugs me about Dore is that he'll continue to speak just so that he doesn't get tagged by YouTube, right? He'll continue to say, well, yeah, of course, even though it's mocking, it's still it's maddening what he says about, he'll say throw off about the vaccines. But early in this, he talked about being vaccine injured. He taught, and he got into all that in ways that were out front. He is so I give him props for that. Your point's well taken. But is he clickbaiting? Is he mining for viewership according to formula? Is he becoming merely that? Wait and see. I don't feel like I'm a choice maker. I'm a choice taker. I'll take whatever I can get to find.
I know what you're saying.
Anyone. I'll take Carlson. I'll take anybody that is willing to at least give voice to however limited the hangout might be, so long as they don't make hermetic the limited hangout. The limited hangout that's hermetic says don't look, is a gaslight. Don't look over here. So for instance, the limited hangout on the Wuhan lab premise and that FBI is even willing, but in very, very clipped and equivocal statement by the FBI director, willing to say, it's logical and possible. Don't know if it's plausible. I guess it could be, but there's all sorts of ways, and it looks pretty damn fishy. All of this sort of equivocations that we ought to denounce for what they are, get rolled up into this, into something very ominous, which is people that you could count on to be really critical are so hungry, so desperate to believe again, or at least not be terrorized by the specter of what the World Economic Forum has in mind for us. That any kind of pushback to grab onto that. You see, the state can be counted on. You see, there are white hats. You see, it is not monolithic. It is not a cabal. It is democracy is still there. There's a glimmer. There's a flicker. Protect that flame. And the sinisterness of that, to me, is that we stop paying attention to this is probably another trick, because you're going to let us see only part. And the Wuhan leak is so seamlessly goes with China did it. China didn't do it. Okay, that was a contract from the U.S. government to that lab. We built that, we set it up, we contracted it, and then we have what we know, but then stop talking about. We know Fauci and Daszak's role in setting all of this up. We know that, but then we stop talking about the emails they had about going after any dissidents. We know that from the Twitter file leak. Thank you, Elon Musk. I don't have to love Elon Musk, but thank you. There's the October 19 event 201, staged by Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins University, a reliable institution for eugenic inquiry and normalization going back decades and decades and decades.
Well,
there's 2017 invoices for COVID-19 test kits. COVID-19 test kits going back to 2017, being manufactured 3 years before it was a thing.
Well, you even had alluded to that in your article about, that stuff on YouTube, at least it was still on there. I don't know with the censorship, they may have taken it down. But these people themselves had already said that there was going to be an epidemic, there was going to be a pandemic. Fauci and stuff.
Fauci had said in 2017 it's coming.
Exactly, yeah. So it's not like, but see, I think that's the that's a lot to take in for average people, though. This forum is almost like trying to sort of do what Dora is doing, but almost on the intimate level, because I think there's a risk of sort of avoiding, if we focus too much on World Economic Forum and too much on the deep state and too much on this, we also have to deal with like individual day-by-day operations too. And I think that that's where it's hard to find a balance, because we do have our own personal identities and everything else invested in this world, and those identities are important, but the way that they become commercialized does trivialize them, and it doesn't bring out the humanity out of people, and that's kind of what I'm sort of dealing with, is showing that this humanity matters, but you have to convince people, how does this matter? Like, show me, Kiko, how does this matter? And I think that's the goal of the forum, is to bring together all these different intersectionalities of political thought, personal identities, but sort of tie that into history and how that's going to form our future. But we have to control that future. We can't let other people control it for us. But we can only do that by talking to each other. That's the crucial part. We have to. So I definitely commend people who are trying to reach across different spectrums and stuff. But even then, that can be vacuums that are left open. And I believe even with people like that, I believe that their vacuums open. They don't talk about certain issues like that. You hear a lot about LGBTQ issues now, but it's very much thrown into a culture war lens. It's not thrown into disgruntled LGBTQ people who don't fall into political affiliations like the media wants you to believe, or racial minority groups who don't fall into these think tank groups like the media wants you to believe. That most people, they're just like everyday people who don't they don't fall into these boxes that people try to put them in boxes, but they're not part of those boxes. And so I think that that's the only thing about it, is understanding these identities and analyzing them, because they are important to me, because I do this for a living. Like, I study Black men, for instance, in literature, Latin American, Caribbean, but I have to do it from a social class, racial lens, economics. I can't just do it based on Blackness, because if you do that, you're limiting yourself. You are opening yourself up to just, oh, this person's all about identity politics. No, it does become identity politics when all you talk about is just that one line of thought. You have to make it cross over into other avenues, and that's when people start to understand it more. But I don't think we have enough people that are teaching that. I don't think people are teaching across class lines and racial lines and making it make sense to people on purpose. I think that's happening because people have their own political baggage, and they can't break away from their baggage in order to inform the people so that they can learn from each other. I think that's what's happening.
I couldn't agree more. this is the pandemic that is been low-grade fever
Oh
in
man,
this
that's a good.
country for a while, and the fever is spiking now with the ghettoization of issues that otherwise are very relevant under circumstances of substantive due process, procedural due process rights in a democracy. How those issues have become made esoteric and have been essentialized beyond the pale, where there's no there at the middle, because there never was a there to being a plural pronoun. There is no there. It's to sensationalize what should be a given: equal rights before the law and judicious rectification before the courts, where those rights have been deprived, is now become a bloated, circular, hortatory rhetoric with academic departments devoted to parsing absurd and substanceless distinctions, distinctions without a difference, and crowding out, as has always been the objective, discussions about class and access to the means of production, and more than ever under the specter of an internet of bodies, which would make Orwell blanch if he were to consider it today. So it's yes and yes, Kiko. Never to dismiss the pertinence of and the viciousness and effectiveness of otherings of all kinds, but to refuse considering the purposes that those serve.
Mm-hmm.
As if taking them all to be merely relevant in interpersonal exchanges, having nothing to do with institutional practices, is one spectacular hustle and a betrayal of the legacy of that would be otherwise hailed on this or that Martin Luther King Day. What is paraded on that day is an insult to the memory.
I couldn't agree more with that. You're exactly right with that. I don't have anything to say against that point of view at all. I did want to talk about some in the concluding 10 minutes with you brought up we talked about COVID, some you made references to COVID, and just reading your from Greta to the Great Reset. I honestly, when I first read that, I was like, okay, how do I connect that? And we don't even have to make a connection, but there always is a connection. And I think if the audience kind of analyzes it and they can see that there has to be a financial backing source, that things go back to money, and control. And so that's the first thing I saw when I read your chapter from Flashpoint in Ukraine and from Greta to the Great Reset, making the emergencies work, because there has to be something going on. I thought about yesterday, we talked about the origins of the war and how all of a sudden we got out of Afghanistan. How that wasn't just something that was not part of the plan. Of course, that was part of the plan. We got out of there so we could get into something else. I mean, that's all it was. I mean, it's all these things that these puppets do. They're all part of a plan. The puppets that we see in the suits and the ties and on television, they're simply just messaging what the real people behind the scenes are doing. And these IMF people and these central banks around the world and stuff. I mean, these people are the ones that are funding all these disasters, and honestly creating the crises themselves. Going back to Fauci, you mentioned Anthony Fauci. But I thought about when I was reading this article from Greta to the Great Reset, the ties that you made with Thunberg and her family. You're right. The media made it seem like when she first got on the scene that she was just this innocent girl, a climate activist, but they didn't even talk about her family. Like they completely just left it out of the equation. And I kind of want you to expand more on that. And then I thought about a court case from 1927 based on your article, and I'll talk about that in a second.
Sure thing. In the case of Greta Thunberg, her family has a long pedigreed connection going back to a great grandfather who was actually a climate scientist and relevant to the coining, I believe, of greenhouse effect. I may be missing that. I'd have to go back to my piece. It's been a while. But he was also affiliated in Sweden with the eugenics movement. Sweden was a leader in Europe, a fervent leader in race theory and race sort of pseudoscience. And that family lineage, as it were, is there. Fast forward, her mother is a sometime opera singer, and has high public profile, inducted by the King of Sweden into a Medal of Honor having to do with environmental activism. I cannot recall now the honorific conferred her. Her father's a sometime TV actor. Their connections to Swedish elite go back and are prevalent. Their connections to the Davos set is extensive. That she was this troubled but valiant Joan of Arc like youth out of nowhere, right, is stagecraft at its finest. Evidence to which is her complete inarticulateness when off script and confronted by real questions, and her refusal to engage, her incapacity to engage, her apparent indifference, disinterest in engaging recently at Davos, and sort of, tracked down, but I can't remember the crew. It's as it were, conservative, independent media voices sort of tracking her down, but respectfully posing questions to her, and then and cross-examining her remarkable, obstinate refusal to speak with, but wait a minute, don't you have some responsibility as a youth? Don't you have any interest in what's going on here? Do you have, and she just was incoherent, studiously incoherent, not autistically incoherent, studiously incoherent. So brushing them off. And she had handlers that then went on the attack. By way of saying, Kiko, she was so sincere and such all this and so on. Wouldn't you think she would take the microphone and use that opportunity to speak to an audience otherwise not favorably disposed to greenhouse gas premises and science? Wouldn't her handlers have scripted her to be prepared for that? This opportunity. So, but as I get at the piece, and Corey, I draw heavily there. I mean, full disclosure, I draw heavily from Corey Morningstar, his compilation of the evidence, his forensic compilation of the evidence. I've got it on the shelf somewhere. I'm forgetting the title now, but as it were, the real Greta Thunberg. So more connections than that. I'm not sure what you'd like.
No. I was going to say, episode 18, I talked with Jake Herrico and Jacob. We talked a lot about, I guess, leftist ideologies. We talked about Marxism, but we dedicated a huge segment to the environment and these environmental movements, these climate movements,
Yeah.
and how there are racist undertones.
Oh.
Because a lot of times there's this white savior complex, and in this case it's Thunberg, and before her there was this woman. I wrote her name down. You mentioned her, Severn Suzuki, this Canadian activist, climate activist. Her dad had big ties to some kind of foundations, and was funded.
Forced to step down by media criticism of where the funding was coming from. Gas oil companies in the U.S.
But all this to say that just the environmental movement itself, you have to question all these different agendas, these climate agendas. And that's not to say that there's not a climate crisis, but the issue is this: it's still tied to money, and someone has to be backing these organizations. And that's the link I drew between the current war that's going on and these climate activist types, because they're tied to people, they're people behind those people who have other intentions. And I can only think that the person that's the spokesperson is also involved in the scheme as well.
Can you give me a moment, Kiko? Yes. Okay. So we'll see you later. Got it. Thank you.
You're fine. And I think these people aren't just simply spokespeople that are innocent. They obviously have handlers. They know exactly what they're doing. They're doing what they're told to do. But I honestly believe that they, deep down, there's a sort of naivete. And eventually that naiveness wears off, because once you see the elevated profile, you start getting connected to people who are really starting to call the shots. And you see that in the climate activist realms right now with the Sunrise Movement. Like that stuff is always tied to some sort of a political affiliation that's funded by these big bankers and these big corporations. And so why would those big mega corporations have any interest in helping save the earth, the rainforests? Like, people have to really start thinking to themselves, do you really believe that people are trying to solve the wars and end the wars? You think that these people want the wars to end? They rely on the wars to bring the money in. And I know that's a very ugly way of looking at it, but that's the reality.
What would George Soros, under the laundering of his Open Societies Foundation, have any interest in Black Lives Mattering? George Soros, who plundered the Japanese economy. George Soros, whose affiliation with the Clintons, omnibus crime bill of 1996, his treacherous brinksmanship in global markets forever. George Soros cares about Black people in America. That 100 million given to Black Lives Matter, that doesn't come without any strings attached.
Exactly. But and it's crazy, and they have their own. I think it's funny. You used a line in your article from Flashpoint. You used a line and said the CIA sponsored journalism. Like, you couldn't be any more correct. But people think that that's far fetched when you say CIA sponsored journalism. But that's all I can think of is this stuff is coming from somewhere. I mean, this is not conspiratorial stuff. I mean, this is pretty much, base knowledge at this point, should be, but they've done such a good job with the PolitiFacts of the world and the Snopes and everybody else. If you type in Google, is this true or false? And then you got some organization that's funded by the government or whoever it is telling you, no, this is what the truth is. And like, seriously, people don't think about this stuff. You're going to take it from a tech company that's funded by and friends with these people? You think that they're going to give you the reality?
And, to Kiko, perhaps an earlier point you make about the construction of identities and the threat posed to us, Matrix-like for Neo, when Morpheus confronts him with, drawing from Baudrillard, right, the desert of the real. And the psyche-shattering consequences of that have to be taken into account. Morpheus says to Neo, I need to tell you that we don't usually take people out of the Matrix after a certain age. The trauma is too much. And the what we're talking about here is that, as it were, the blue pill crowd. We're willing to tolerate only so much. I had a very good friend, a very precocious, incredibly bright peer in grad school. He was by far the most talented among our cohort at Portland State University. Remain unnamed. But I engaged him on 9/11 many years ago. And then when COVID came, tried to get back to just because we happened to be getting back together virtually. He's up in Portland, I'm down here. And I love the guy's company and curiosity, perspicacity, and all that. And but he's, 9/11 conspiracies were, as it were, a bridge too far, is how he put it in platitude. This otherwise a very precocious guy, very, very willing to examine. Yeah. But
isn't it crazy though?
What's that?
Isn't it crazy how you have these people that are so like exploratory and free thinking, but it's like how's that a cap on free thought if you're a free thinker? It's as it were Edenic. Do not eat from the tree, this tree of knowledge. Do not draw fruit from this tree. From everything else, you're welcome. And this seems to me quite simplistically the formula of our organs of propaganda in the United States. You look at all of what you are furnished in this first among equals, still sterling, perhaps smudged and bruised democracy. But look what we do not actively censor. We do not this, we do not that. And look, all of this you can have, but this one tree, do not question the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Do not pose questions like Free Thinkers Forum is willing to host. You can pose them. You can only go so far, and because your people you would otherwise count on will turn on you like so many Agent Smiths. You thought they were friends. You thought they were colleagues, but you turn around and an instant later, they got a loaded pistol to your head. Don't say another thing, or I will symbolically erase you with my bullets of scorn, derision, hurt feelings, sort of snarky contempt. Sort of, don't make me unleash don't force me into the zombie horde that I can become. And then the radical isolation of you, me, and others, which are more and more legion, and more otherwise than where we thought we'd find them, showing up on Tucker Carlson. We don't have to love and trust and all of that of them, or much less give them a hagiography. I completely agree. And we should probably have measured distrust and suspicion. But to Jimmy Dore's frequent point, he'll talk to anyone willing to talk about Medicare for all, willing to talk about these things. He'll talk with anyone, and he reserves the right at the end to be skeptical. So you'd like him to take more of his own medicine. I respect the point. We have to realize that, as with neighbors I have across the street who would introduce himself to me as, the classic of the arch conservative, retired professional white guy. Matt, I want you to know that I'm right wing of Attila the Hun. Is that going to be a problem? That I have more to talk to with my neighbor Bill on issues, Kiko, we've spoken about, and that he would be in way more disposed to talking to me about than my otherwise erstwhile, hitherto ideological kin and colleagues. I have more to talk with this person at this point in frank, candid discussions and find more common ground, although very obviously things that we don't, values that we don't share, but that are much less relevant than the values we do share. Mm-hmm.
And this has been Doerr's mantra. I will stick to it to his credit. Where
Mm-hmm.
I find values I share, of course I'm going to talk to someone.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't I talk to them? What possible reward, other than a furtive, smug, virtue signaling piety, am I being paid off
Mm-hmm.
not to talk to them? Your
Mm-hmm.
point taken is he constructing persona at this point more than he is engaging long form anything? That he rounds everything off back to persona. And I think that is a great get and a legitimate criticism.
Yeah, that's the only, and it's just yeah, that's kind of where I'm at or whatever, and that's fine or whatever. Like he's almost gotten to the point where he's not mainstream media, but he's big. I mean, look how big Rogan is.
Well, he's a fraction of Rogan.
He's yeah, he is, but he could eventually become something that's like on a smaller scale. But basically, they have very similar types of audiences in lots of different ways.
They do. But then you have Russell Brand, who's interviewed with both of them, right? Rogan and Doerr.
He's another one that I kind of put in that. Like I know all these people you're talking about. But I'm almost closed up to it now because I still think that a lot of that is driven by, is it personality? Like
Okay.
I'm struggling with that. What you just summarized perfectly. Like you exactly encapsulated what I was thinking.
Yeah, they're not Glenn Ford. They're not Glenn Ford. They're not, and they're not gonna be Glenn Ford.
Right.
That doesn't mean they don't have integrity. It doesn't mean they don't have sincerity. And Glenn Ford did not reach 11 million people on just subscribers, to say nothing of relists and reboots like Joe Rogan, who can reach 40 million on the regular.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'd much rather hang out with Glenn Ford.
Right. Yeah.
I'm gonna learn a lot more from Glenn Ford.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna think much more integrally with Glenn Ford.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to force magnify with Glenn Ford in the way that is potentially going to happen with Joe Rogan, and seems to be happening with Joe Rogan. And that's not a nothing. Every movement's karma keepers, Glenn Ford, had to make do with the hustlers because they knew how to get some shit done.
Yeah.
So what we got to work with, right, in this world. And so I'm grateful, if for nothing else, that their counter narrative, it has some amplitude to it. It has amplitude. It's not whispered. It's got amplitude and it's got frequency, and that jams up some of the signals. Getting back to a matrix analogy, jamming the signals, and as Morpheus would put it, our pirate signals, transmitting the best we can to whoever is out there picking them up. And when you got signal jammers like a guy like Rogan, and then Doerr is, to your point, really kind of a spinoff in some ways. I mean, Doerr, I think, preceded Rogan, but he is certainly aping Rogan's approach in some ways, though Rogan sticks very much to the long form and Doerr does not.
Doerr's more into political. We actually talked about this specifically with my friend Tyler King. He's a personal friend of the family. I think it was episode 7 he came on, and we talked 7 or 8, and we discussed this precisely about the audience types of these the Jimmy Doers, the Russell Brands, the even the Kim Iversons, the Tulsi Gabbard crowd. Like, you have those types of groups, and there's a lot of political variance in the country, and just that crosses all types of demographics. And I think the struggle is that I kind of understood that, like, because I've been this type of mindset for a long time. And so, but I can see where maybe that's refreshing for people who are newer to sort of opening their mind up to different changes in the world of politics and culture. But for someone with me, I think once you get established enough, it almost becomes stale after a while. And it's like, for me, that's how Jimmy Dore got to me. He became kind of stale after a while because I saw the same playbook over and over. I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, I get it. Class lines. Like, he used the same analogy when he talks about Chris Smalls and unionizing the workers in New York. He uses the same line every time about you don't throw the Trumpers off who want to unionize. You don't throw away the libertarian gun nuts. You don't throw them away if they agree with you on the issue. I'm like, I get it, dude. Like, I get it. It's like, how many times are you going to say that?
Yeah.
It's like he's used that example like 20 times I've seen in his interviews and stuff. That's all I'm saying is that I think that if I have people who are like pretty much Jimmy Dore fans, and like he's like their main option, and I'm like, okay, that presents its own set of problems. If you're following Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum, and I'm the only source of your information or the main source, then I would question your sanity too. And this is my platform. I just think that you need to be as free and open as you can. Because when you get limited to one outlet, that creates its own set of vacuums and issues.
I think of it in some ways, considering your really incisive points here, Kiko, helping me think through some stuff. And okay, so I'm going to jump back to the Matrix, man. There's my comeback. But where Neo is trucking in the black market of virtual simulation. So this gaggle of lost boys and girls comes to his pad at one point, the girl with the white rabbit, on her shoulder. Mm-hmm. And he had just received his first signal from Morpheus, follow the white rabbit, and knock Neo. The opioid crisis, the need under conditions of toxic cultural tyrannies to inoculate oneself, to self-medicate, I think we should realize the pharmacology of all that extends exactly to your point that, hey man, I need my Jimmy Dore hit. I need my Joe Rogan hit. I need my this hit, because that's what it is. In some ways, that is what it becomes. Now, to Rogan's credit, although he soundbites his stuff, right? His stuff is fed for clickbait in all sorts of 10-minute, 15-minute, 12, 9, 8 minute. To keep your
attention span because it's so low as it is.
Because your attention span is so low, because I got to get to Jimmy, man. I don't have much time because I got 2 jobs and 4 kids and a dog to bury. And I mean, it's like, so I really think people are I can relate to this, and particularly the more isolated we get, and there is no Morpheus. We don't get any follow the white rabbit to destiny, man. We're stuck and incredibly alone. More and more. And the COVID lockdown just was an orchestration that was seamless for at the very moment when people had shared purposes with the declining economy, and the blowback of the 2008 gasoline fire produced by the quantitative easing that just forestalled the imminence of more of the same, but spectacularly more catastrophic circumstances. The opioid crisis corresponding with that, come on, people, knock. And there's with all of that, there's another thing to talk about as the fourth industrial revolution, which also much of this noise, very like the noise of the 1920s and 30s, was covering up, was the move to the second industrial revolution that would give us the permanent war economy after World War II. Yeah. And the public had to be subdued from their skepticism about the imperial gambits of the Spanish-American War, and Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, to the World War I. They were still weary of an America succumbing to the imperial gambits of Europe. They were still weary. What happened? The big one comes along, and Roosevelt's New Deal comes along to convince them government is there for them. My grandparents, otherwise very conservative Southern Baptists, were Roosevelt Democrats. I don't think they ever voted Democrat again, but they were Roosevelt Democrats because he did something that they couldn't imagine. An elite, one of their own, would endorse their most treasured causes. Causes that had been around for decades, since the beginning of industrialism in the country, but finally could not be refused anymore. Could not, right? And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. How did that happen? Why did it happen? Was it as much a propaganda move by what was going to become the New Deal? A keynote incident that could not be lived down by the same old laissez-faire crowd. And what the New Deal did was consolidate labor into the purposes of management.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right.
the big buy-in sellout that the National Labor Relations Act inaugurated. A Trojan horse. On the one hand, conceding to labor what it had been begging for, fighting for, dying for decades in the country. Now it finally gets legitimated before the court. Now it's the law of the land. But the under the table trade-off was you labor now are no longer going to ask the big questions about production, the big questions about your stake beyond wage slavery to the lords of production. You no longer are going to have wildcat strikes. You're going to give due notification. You're going to come to the table with good faith. You're going to be inextricably part of the machine now. That's the trade-off. That's the grand bargain. And fast forward. We need a new grand bargain for the fourth industrial, which is not just the Internet of Things, but the Internet of our bodies, biometric tech. A new bargain. You, the public, are going to have to accept chips. You're going to have to accept passports. But wait a minute, we need a pretext to shatter your consciousness of what you were before. What would that pretext be? What would work? Well, as with the project for the New American Century, saying the quiet part out loud in their position paper to this effect, we're going to need something big, something along the lines of a new Pearl Harbor, because there's no way the American public will accept a gambit post-Soviet for the United States to dominate the world otherwise. Fast forward to COVID. There's no way the American public will accept vaccine passports, green passports, carbon credits, not just for corporations, but for individuals, as with a social credit rating system coming to us sooner than later, modeled on China, denied everywhere that's the intention. So we needed a pretext. Right? Families against families, neighbors against neighbors, not unlike the Civil War. Nothing I've seen. I was too young to really see closely the protests of Vietnam, but I don't think they come near the divisiveness of what's happened with COVID. I may be wrong, but from the standpoint of deep-seated antagonisms, I don't know. Anyway, it's something to consider.
I think it goes into these people are so good at capitalizing on the moments. I think that's what it is. It does feel more intensified. I'm only 40 years old, so I don't have a lot of life to sort of think about as far as these different stages of propaganda and this mass delusion. But I think it's very intensified. But I honestly felt like that after the George Floyd protest. Like me personally, that's when hysteria kind of hit me. But then it wore off, and I realized. But even though I took that really hard, and I was really just bombarded with just all the mainstream, just all the just friends texting me like, "Are you okay, Kiko?" Like seriously, just like I got all kinds of stuff during that time period. Just people I hadn't heard from in 10 years would send me messages during the whole time period. Every black person in the country was all of a sudden, like I gotta have another black friend. I mean, I'm not trying to trivialize it, but I I have to just say that to myself now. Like we seriously trivialized like a moment and they increase more police funding. It's like the whole point is like it's police brutality. So let's give the police more money as a political angle and just show how dumb the population is. Let's just give the police more money, even though they're saying defund the police. Let's just give them more money, which I think was always part of the plan anyway, is just to, you know, install another, set of agendas or whatever they had going on. And I was thinking on the other side before that even happened, that was tied into the election, obviously. Um, Dr. Rasmus yesterday brought up the point of, with Biden being in office and the acceleration and the escalation of the war, which we know that he's a known warmonger, but people aren't putting these things together. They're looking at, oh my gosh, but I got to support the blue team because that guy's a Democrat, so I got to support that side. And I'm like, do you not see the connections between your party and the corruption and the history of puppeteering, of warmongering, and war profiteering over all these years, and you don't see it? How Republicans and Democrats do the same thing, and they're all connected together, and it's destroying our country, our economy, and it's destroying us because now we created vacuums and echo chambers to where we can't even talk to people because the deep state has told you who you can talk to and who you can't talk to. And it goes back to everything you've been saying. And I I wish we could talk 2 more hours. I definitely want to bring you back on, but I have somewhere else to go right now. But
Sure.
I wanted to leave it to you the last minute or so. If you had like a final conclusion or any final words, and how can my audience get in touch with you in case they had a question or a comment? What would be the easiest way to get in contact with you, Professor Witt?
Sure, Kiko. First, I want to bring back to your attention what I posted in your chat, Agnotology, a Substack of Toby Rogers and reference to the book material. I think it's right up your alley, Kiko, and love to get with you on that material. I had a chance to read it. I just ordered it myself at some point. So the manufacture of ignorance and the intersection with what you just gave testament, which is deep and abiding, the deepest and most abiding human needs for fraternity, closeness, bonding, and in the face of trauma that gets recycled just when we thought we had some mastery over it, we had some whatever it is, and there it is blown right back up in our face. And there's a lot of actually reasons to question the whole manufacture of the Floyd incident, beginning with his affiliation with a cop alleged to have killed him, working as security guards together, and would have to have had foreknowledge of each other beforehand, for that matter. These little leaks that come out that fracture again our sense. It's almost as if we'd rather relive the trauma because we know how to survive that than to crack open the manufacture of that and face the premise. There are people so evil, there is a force so evil and malevolent in this world that without scruple, so profoundly without scruple, would do that to people over and over and over again for purposes that have nothing to do with anything other than the propagation of more evil. And it's at that point, really, that you have to entertain premises about Satanism, whatever is your ontological disposition, metaphysical or otherwise, towards God and so on. The premise of an absolute evil, at some point, you're forced to confront. You're forced to face that. I'll close on this. Back to the Matrix. One of the most spectacular images I have from that is the penultimate scene where he goes to the machine city and finally confronts the consciousness in unmediated. And what is it? How does it materialize before him? But as a buzzing, a buzzing constellation of tiny drone, insect-like drones that he had just encountered being led up to the staging of this. And how do they materialize? A raging infant. You may recall a raging infant with a satanically inflected voice, but it was an infant's face. And this may be a motif that's been used before in sci-fi. Now Terry Gilliam's Brazil uses the mask of an infant in a horrific scene of torture going back to the 80s. Yeah, it may be derivative.
It could be, yeah.
But it sticks with me that the malevolence is as without purpose or scruple, like an infant given infinite power. And I'm just going to leave it there, because plumbing the sense making of forces that would unleash a bioweapon, that would then use that as pretext for the suborning of civil liberties and the ruination of careers for those who dare to dissent against the orthodoxy with good reason, because everything they know about virology was contradicted by the rollout of the emergency. To say nothing of what we're discovering from all-cause mortality statistics of a dramatic increase in deaths across the board following the vaccine rollout, up to 40% across the globe, from numbers that cannot be disputed.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of consciousness can produce that? And I think for me, the change for me in outlook towards what is to be done is coming to terms somehow in my self with evil. I have been raised, probably like you as an intellectual, weaned on all sorts of discourses that are radically dismissive of metaphysics, of sources beyond the ken of our rational capacity to discern. Mm-hmm. and embroidered in all sorts of ways post-structurally to enthrall us, right? Foucault, etc. With a sort of acumen that can decipher the real, but again in a kind of profound gaslighting, because of the refusal to look over into the dark and to really plumb the dark. And so, for what it's worth, given that this disturbs the psyche and shatters the sleep cycle, I don't want to belabor the point more with you here, but yield to the reference to agnotology as maybe, Kiko, and I'd love your intellectual take on how that may be a useful way because I'm hearing about it for the first time, and I thought I was pretty informed, but I'm hearing about this premise for the first time. Ignorance is manufactured. And on the one hand, you and I both know that, but how we could formulate that in a critical discourse and incorporate other intellectuals of our creed to begin probing, right, and steering the light over. If it could happen here, and you accept that premise, good liberal virtue signaler, and you would have to accept that it could be steered here. Would you not have to? So Socratically sort of induct the blue-pilled person. Last point. When did blue and red state come around? Are you old enough to recall when it came around? I don't ask that rhetorically. I don't remember and wonder if it corresponded with the 2000 election.
You said the blue to red state, just like that terminology?
Yeah, the terminology.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to tell you because but I think that they just use the generational playbook, because the boomers and the people that can remember, I guess, would they be boomers if they remembered Lyndon B. Johnson and just that whole the Southern strategy and how the parties flipped when the blacks used to be more tied to the Republican Party, and then you had all the Dixiecrats and the Southern states' rights people, all that switched during the 60s. But the blue state, red state stuff, I believe that's more of an 80s rendition. That's what I'm thinking.
I don't remember it going back that far at all.
Maybe not.
I associate with much more recent, and I'm finally going to leave you with this: blue pill, red pill. Here's the thing. Look where I sit, and I want to keep talking about this. I feel like the conservatives in the country are red pilled at this point. And these are people with whom I don't have much in common except a willingness to fathom the desert of the real. This I have profoundly in common with them.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Democrat allegiance is a zombie horde of blue-pilled people who can't get enough of that opioid. They cannot get enough of that. I would love to know where blue pill, red pill originated, because you see where I'm going. Red party, red state, red pilled. Whereas the red pill is a metaphor, a motif for fathoming the desert of the real and facing down all of that. If you can associate that with racism, homophobia, chauvinism, misogyny, if you can associate all things red with that, then any association with red pilled starts to become negatively connotated. And I don't put it past that. In other words, it's the most simple algorithms that work. When it comes to influencing people, it's got to be simple, stupid. And so these algorithms, these psychologized rubrics ginned up by the Rand Corporation 60 years ago in their torture experiments, they were doing it, culminating with LSD and then MK Ultra. This is stuff they are masters at. So that they are working up formulations like this to befuddle and beguile, I think is worth considering. And whether under the rubric of agnotology, deep state discussions or what, but maybe there's some concordance there, Kiko, worth us continuing to think about.
I want to definitely continue a conversation with you and bring you back on for sure. I have the feeling that it's going to be a different conversation, but I think some of the subject matters we hit today, I'm pretty sure reading Norm Finkelstein's new book about identity politics is going to be more or less accompanying with that conversation we had today, because I'm interviewing Norm next month. And I'm curious to hear what he has to say about a lot of what we talked about today as well.
Very good. I'll look for that interview.
Yes, for sure. It had dropped towards the end of April, but I wanted you to give my audience like any as far as the information, like how can people reach out to you if they had a question or
Sure
comment.
thing. I mean, I'm available by email primarily. I'll put it in your chat. So mwitt@laverne.edu.
Okay.
They can, if they don't want to go on channel with my institution, they can reach me at that's my private.
Okay.
So yeah, that's fine. I trust your crowd. Uh, Absolutely, they want to reach out as a result of this and expand the discussion. Happy to. I don't know if we need a code word or some kind of handshake thing, hand off to them, but
No, that's funny. But no, I've had such a pleasure. This has been a fun conversation, a dynamic, interesting conversation, and I'm really glad that we didn't exhaust the Ukraine Russia stuff because honestly, I almost feel like that is I have to be very centered and very calculated what I want to approach, when I bring people on and stuff. And you can beat a dead horse sometimes, like even with
yeah,
stuff that's really important.
right.
And I have a feeling that based on what we talked about today, who knows what the next crisis is going to be? What are we going to be talking about this same time next year? What is it going to be next? What's going to be the next big thing? Is it going to be the Ukraine flag on the Facebook post? Or is it going to be another country? And that's not to ridicule people, but it just shows how people change all of a sudden, and what sparks those changes, just all of a sudden, just let's put this new banner on Facebook or Instagram. But anyway, my audience, I hope you all enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Witt, Matt Witt. That's at Laverne, the University of Laverne in Laverne, California. Thanks so much for joining us, beautiful people. In store, we have Jihad Kubing, a personal friend of mine. He's going to talk about Cameroon, Arab, and Black African relations. We're going to talk about his dissertation that he wrote in 2018 as well. And I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation Thursday with Jihad, a personal friend of mine that's at McDaniel, University of McDaniel in Maryland, Westminster, Maryland. Have a great day. This was a great episode 31, and I can't wait for the future episodes and Professor Witt down the road. Thank you so much again for joining us. Cheers, beautiful people.